Hello, bonjour, and miigwech. Welcome to Wading Through Economic Filth or Wealth of Nation, where I seek to explain things going on in the Canadian and global economies. I'm Greg Quinn. I've spent the last 2 decades as a business reporter in Ottawa. I have a master's degree in economics and in journalism. I'm trying to merge those skills into this evolving world of media tech at a time of rising disinformation. I also wrote a book, Crisis and Calm, which you could see over my shoulder. That's about the work of Canada's central bank. Inflation and affordability have dominated society in the last few years. The Bank of Canada is a big part of the picture when it comes to those topics. Today I'm going to look at inflation itself and something called core inflation, which is turning out to be something of an illusion. We are learning the hard way. There's no single measure of inflation that can remove all of the misleading signals about the real trend of consumer prices. For decades now, central bankers assured themselves that if they just removed a certain consistent set of items from the overall consumer price index, they would be able to distinguish between short-term false alarms and a genuine rise or fall in the pace of inflation. This measure that's created when a few items are taken out of the inflation basket is called a core index. There is some merit in this kind of thinking. At one point, I was told that as much as 75% of the movement in inflation around that time, a certain time, was caused by gasoline alone. And in many cases, just taking out even less than a dozen items from the thousands of goods and services that go into the consumer price index does remove a lot of volatility. And during an earlier era known as the Great Moderation, inflation was tame anyways, and core inflation was often a good tool. But even then, there were warning signs. There was a case where the bank had a hiccup around an odd movement in auto insurance premiums. So why is core inflation hard to get right? If there really isn't a magic index, should we abandon thinking about a single set of indicators and take on a suite of things? Will that create problems of its own? If you have 5 indicators of trend inflation, when do you decide to focus on one over the other? And does it create a fuzziness around public policy? There's another option. Around the world, there's a pretty standard measure of what you might call central inflation. It's just called inflation excluding food and energy. That's also fairly easy for the public to understand. All of this is critical because without a good guide to the future trend of inflation, central banks in Canada around the world are prone to what are called overshoots. In other words, when you're supposed to be taking interest rates high, you keep them low or vice versa. So let's back up for just a moment. To state the obvious, in any given hour or even over the course of a few minutes, gasoline prices can move up by, say, 10 or 20 cents. But that often has very little to do with whether the cost of living across Canada will rise by 2% this year or 3%. Also, when you think about any kind of natural product like avocados or apples or coffee beans, they can suffer from a bumper crop or they can face a severe drought that hurts production. Well, that makes good headlines to say that the price of coffee is about to skyrocket. This is, again, something that's unlikely to create a persistent trend, even in the price of coffee over several years. And monetary policy just simply can't be used fast enough to tamp down a change in prices that's only going to last for a short while. More importantly, I think we humans are all subject to bias of seeing high-profile products and thinking that it will affect our entire family budget. The truth is, a jump in the price of cauliflower is likely not going to swing the entire family budget because we can substitute, we can buy frozen, we could do many other things. We could buy discounted brands. There are many ways to kind of change the effective price, the effective price we're paying for a particular product, and also, a doubling of the price of one kind of food is generally not going to change the overall inflation rate a family might experience. But the trick here is when it comes to trying to figure out how to build a core index is that at any given time, a certain product can give a misleading price signal. Food and energy costs jumped as Russia invaded Ukraine. That's because the Ukraine produces a lot of food and a lot of fertilizer. Russia is a major oil producer. But the standard reaction we saw from central bankers at the time, most prominently the US Federal Reserve, was to call the rise in prices transitory. This was in line with kind of older thinking that, food and energy, again, are volatile. They go up for a little while and then they eventually come back down. In hindsight, ignoring those gains was incorrect. In fact, I believe one reason U.S. inflation has been so sticky for so long that after the initial burst of prices, this also appeared to create a change in the cost of some services that persisted long after the initial shock to food prices climbed back down. But let's focus on the Bank of Canada. It has gone through several attempts at creating a better measure of core inflation. There was one called CPIX that didn't work out too well. As I mentioned earlier, they created 3 measures more recently that were called median, common, and trim. They're very hard to explain to the public in the first place, but one of them has also already been abandoned by the bank, and the other 2 have been a little bit discounted by Governor Tiff Macklem, because when inflation came down from the post-pandemic burst, the core inflation measures stayed definitely a noticeable amount higher than overall prices. And that just didn't seem to line up with the economic slowdown we've seen recently. So there is a growing feeling among economists that there is no really good measure of core inflation. Again, this leads to a question because the Bank of Canada is reviewing its overall policy framework this year. Can you really not have a core measure of inflation, something that gives you a bit of an edge over just watching the overall consumer price index? Again, if you start using different measures of core, multiple ones at the same time, you may have a tendency to focus on one over the other. You could lose some transparency. You introduce more complexity. The danger is you get a mediocre result. So what this maybe comes back down to is policy making really often is more of an art than a science. It relies on common sense, experience, and good judgment. Things you deploy after looking at all of the data. And there's no measure of inflation that can ever really stand in for that. And in the end, policymakers are going to be judged on results, not what tools they use to generate them. Even if we go back to an era of very stable inflation, policymakers might be wise not to be lured back into thinking that any single core inflation measure will work all the time, and that they really have to be prepared to cut off any swings in prices if they see a danger lurking in the overall data. Thanks for watching. See you next time.